What is crack-a-lackin', fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Damta Valley. Hopefully, you're hearing me after that. This is the first time you're hearing me, that there was not a long intro recorded to say that this was dated, because I'm trying to put out some of these look-aheads before I go traveling. And I am very excited, as always, to be joined by the one and only Ti Windisch. Follow him on Twitter, not X, which sounds like a porn site, but on Twitter, at Ti Windisch. That's at TIWINDISCH. He is the co-host of the Gyro Step Podcast and, I don't know, founder, head honcho of the Gyro Step Podcast Network. You can follow them on Twitter at GCPN Network on Twitter. I should have wrote that one down.
I think it's at GSPN Hub, which also sounds like a porn site. GSPN Hub at X.com is like a crazy thing to direct people
Follow
to.
GSPN Hub at X.com and definitely punch in GSPN at X.com into your search toolbar and just see what comes up. We're going to be talking Milwaukee Bucks. I am very excited because I feel like this team, and I caught shit for saying this on a podcast, they've flown under the radar, not where people think they're bad, but they've just flown under the radar this offseason, I feel like, because they didn't do mega splashy stuff aside from pay their own guys and work on the margins. But first, we asked the question that I need to know the answer to. Ti, how the heck are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited for these every year. Always a little nervous. Someone else will emerge on your radar who's better, of which options there are many. But I'm glad I get to do it again. This is literally one of the podcasts I look forward to throughout the year because your questions are so good. I agree with you on the Bucks flying under the radar. I catch shit for saying this all the time. But it's difficult to quantify, and it is an entitled kind of way for your team to fly under the radar because it's not that they're underrated, and I don't think they have been for years now, but this is like the Bucks coverage every summer. I'd say post Jrue Holiday, because that was like, is Giannis going to sign? They made a big move. A lot of people hated it at the time, which did not age well for them, but it was like, since that summer, it's like, yeah, they're going to be really good. They'll probably be like 1 or 2 in the East, and they have a chance. They're probably my favorite team to come out of the East. Let's go and talk about anything else for 45 minutes. It's like, that's nice to hear. Like, I would like to hear the team analyze more on these, you know what I'm saying? Like these shows where it's like, okay, let's talk about the Eastern Conference. We got 10 seconds of Milwaukee. They're good. Boston, 30 minutes. The Knicks, 2 hours on the Knicks. And really, this just means we're going to talk about Joel Embiid. Let's talk about James Harden. Let's talk about, what Daryl Morey's tweeting. So I'm glad to deep dive the Bucks here with you.
I will say I must curate my content properly because when people complain about national coverage, and I'm like, I never hear any of this shit.
Yeah,
where it's
you do a good job
when it's on the Knicks and it's just Joel being like, I'm just not subjected to that. I do think people conflate to actually bring us to the Bucks. They conflate under the radar with like underrated or they're not good. And it's that's not. It's like you said, they're just mentioning the Bucks are great in passing. I would argue that's the better alternative to though hearing like just out of touch analysis for 2 hours on like what your team should be doing. They're just like, we get the Knicks for star hunting, but they don't view this team as like, oh, we think they suck and like we're not doing anything. So, and I'm going to skip ahead because this is like deeper in the outline, but this kind of segues into what we're talking about now. It does feel like, though, for a team that flies under the radar, Zach Lowe said something like this recently on the podcast to the effect of whenever the Bucks lose before the finals, basically, or just have an early playoff exit, it's always painted as the world is falling for them or there's this fatal flaw that they can't overcome. And he said that, and I'm like, that's accurate. Why is that? Like, why is that a thing? Like, what is the misconception there? Or what is the sentiment? Like, what do the Bucks do that make, I would say nationally, fans are probably more people in the Milwaukee market, definitely more like in tune to the steady analysis, but it's what about them is so polarizing that when something goes wrong, it feels bigger to a lot of people than in actuality it is.
I mean, I think in the modern league where there's not 10-year contracts and there are trade demands, anytime a player like Giannis plays in a market like Milwaukee, there's going to be a little bit of like that internal pressure. And I think I'm not saying like this is media BS. Like it's real. Giannis wants to win. And as small market affectionate as he is, like there's other places where he could go and like go to restaurants and, not get mobbed, right? Like it's not Milwaukee and then 29 big markets in the NBA or even, there's other small markets that are very competitive as well. I think the back and forth between fan bases around Giannis and Luka has always kind of existed and will continue to rise up and maybe neither of them ever move teams, but I do think there's like, both sides are like, oh, we'd love that guy. That would be a fun pairing, huh? So that's out there, and I think that's part of the reason is you have that player in Giannis who pre this playoff run from Nikola Jokic, it's pretty much been the consensus top player in the league for 3, 4, however many years now. He was winning when he was winning MVPs. It was less consensus. Post the MVPs, I think, and of course championship run, he's kind of been locked in there. And now Jokic is getting the lion's share of that discussion, which I think makes sense. To be clear, I'm not like the salty Bucks guy about that. When you watch a guy do it like that, and by do it I mean rampage through the NBA, he deserves to have that mantle for the next season. I think, like I was saying, Kawhi was the best after his run with the Raptors, because it's like, all right, if you tear everyone's throats out for 4 rounds like that, like you can wear that next season. Like someone has to prove it. Sadly for Kawhi, we haven't really gotten that showdown that we should have because of all the injuries. But so I think it's really just comes down to that. It's and they're older too. They're not the Nuggets. They're not the Nuggets where even if they had lost this year, maybe it would start to get a little louder just because how do you not winning when Jokic plays like that? But Murray and Porter and them are so young, and their team is put together. I think it's more clearly sustainable going forward for what they have on that roster and their assets. Whereas the Bucks, it is kind of like this. They have like this careening down the tracks feel of like, okay, Khris has another injury. We're re-signing Brook, but he's old now, right? He's still playing really well, but he's old.
What
Jrue
a trajectory, man.
It's insane. I can't wait for the Brook Lopez doc and Robin just like shitting on him, and it's going to be really fun too. The back and forth they have. Jrue said he would retire after this contract. We'll see if that happens. That was like, people forget that. I hear a lot of like, oh, is Jrue going to re-sign him? Like, is he going to keep playing? I guess we'll see. So yeah, I think it's like the pressure of having a Giannis in a small market with a little bit of an older roster, not just a little bit. I think it makes sense, but I think everyone assumes they're closer to the end than they have been, certainly, and also they've lost in some pretty weird ways. Like if they went up against the Nuggets and lost in 7, and it was like a great series in the finals, or let's even say Boston and like the semis, to not use the finals as an example, I think it would be viewed differently. But the last 2 times they've lost, it was Boston in the second round, and sure, without Khris. Like I think looking back now and what Boston has done around that series, I think from a Bucks perspective, probably feel pretty good about that one. Like you got pretty close without Khris Middleton. You blew it, but you got close. And then, of course, almost getting swept in the first round by a play-in team. The way they've gone out, too, like when they lost to Miami in the bubble, it was kind of similar, all the expectations, and they kind of went out sad. So I think it's a lot that goes into it. I think it makes sense the way it's looked at to a certain extent, and I think it speaks a lot to the Bucks culture and what they've built, that they haven't had like the big blow up really after any of these losses. Like they've kept it together.
Yeah, I thought there was an overreaction to how I still think Miami was fantastic. I missed on them. Whatever they are # built different for the playoffs.
Yeah,
like that is it's a thing with them, and some of it's ineffable. I still think if Giannis doesn't get injured, that the Bucks win that series, and that's just Bud might still be employed. But looking at their offseason and specifically what they did with the on-court personnel, a lot of it, at least financially, is built around talent retention. But you get Jay Crowder, you get Malik Beasley. Just what did you think about like the moves and the contracts that they gave out this year?
Yeah, I think a lot of Bucks fans were underwhelmed. I mean, we did so much content on who they could get for the mini MLE, and it ends up not opening because Brook rightfully went and got a contract that demonstrates his value to the league. He probably still underpaid, but as kind of when Vucevic got the extension,
still sour that he's not in Houston.
Oh, for sure.
Very clearly, they thought that he was coming.
Definitely. I mean, when Vucevic gets $20 million, he's a fine player, and Pirtle gets around $20 million. I do think Brook is better, and those guys I think got longer term than Brook did. But he just finished second.
And I'm even sorry to interrupt you, but if he's 4 or 5, like if he's 31 instead of 35. Like you're probably like, oh, does Brook Lopez get like 4 and 140 or something? Like maybe not the max, but like something along those lines. Because Vooch is the perfect comparison where it's like Vooch is a really useful player. Brook Lopez is way better. He's just in NBA years way older.
Yeah, exactly. And had the back thing, came back from it better somehow. I mean, the dedication he has.
About that last year, where it's like, Oh, like he didn't look like he looked a little stiff when he came back at first. Like he'd be always like, no, he's just gonna finish runner-up for defensive player of the year. He'll be fine.
And I think had a case for. I think a lot of years he probably wins, but I think and even I eventually came to the conclusion like, all right, Jaren Jackson's season is just insane defensively and what he's able to do. So the minutes played gap was there, but he was a deserving defensive player of the year. Jaren was. I think Brooke had a great case too, but. They lose the mini MLE, which sucked, but getting Khris day 1 and Brooke day 2, I've tried to make this point, like any franchise that could have signed Khris Middleton and Brooke Lopez to like 50-ish million a year contracts, they would be celebrating. Like that would be an amazing summer. You're retaining them, it's easier, but this is unrestricted free agency. Like nothing is given. Look at Toronto, who certainly would have loved to, and they're my favorite. Like, no, Bucks are fine. Look what it could be. But seriously, like they really wanted Fred VanVleet back and couldn't do it. Like it's not always easy to retain those guys, even when you are a good team with Giannis. So I think overall it was a very good summer. It really hurt to lose Javon Carter. I'm still bullish on his potential as like a true point guard in addition to the floor spacing defender of point guards that he's been. Did not have a great playoff series though. He didn't play much the last postseason. This year his minutes were better, but he just wasn't able to produce as much, which I think probably had an impact there. And also, like the Bucks are just trending really huge, which is an interesting thing we can talk about. And Javon didn't fit into that much either. But that's the kind of player you lose when you're a good team with this many good, well-paid rotational players, as tough as it is. And I thought the additions they made, Crowder and Beasley for the price points were really intriguing as well. And when you can get Malik Beasley on vet min, it really does make you go, okay, I don't really care about the mini MLE then. I mean, I would have liked, like when players get paid, that's all great. And it would have made it easier to resign him. But like that's a mini MLE player, at least in my estimation. So that certainly made that loss a lot more palatable.
Which this is a whole other can of worms. I still can't believe the players union signed that CBA because these are the players right now who are being impacted. I think maybe not so much Jake. Like you have to play, and Jay Crowder sat out for most of last year.
Yeah,
but like Malik Beasley feels like I know he didn't shoot the ball well. Wasn't in the Lakers rotation by the end of the playoffs. But like if it was like let's say January, there would have been a team that might have given up a first-round pick for just Malik Beasley alone because he was under team control for another. That's how well he was shooting the ball. So to get him at the minimum is huge. What was more surprising to you there, though, that Malik Beasley was available at the minimum, that Jay Crowder came back?
I would say Beasley for sure. I thought Crowder, even before it was announced, it was possible when Bud got fired because I think that is that's your bridge, right? In terms of the organization of Crowder, because he didn't play as much. He said he didn't know what his role was. At the time, it's like, well, you didn't play well in the playoffs at all. And he didn't. He had a really bad playoffs. My counter to this, though, has been he had a really good regular season with Milwaukee. Like, I thought he looked like a perfect hand-in-glove fit. He was communicating on defense. He was hitting shots. I knew that wouldn't last through multiple playoff rounds. But everything else I felt like would. Just didn't come together right in the playoffs. And I think there's been some other quotes, too, about the relationships between the coaching staff and the players. And I think the old one, to be clear, Mike Budenholzer and his staff, and Bobby Portis in particular mentioned losing Darvin Ham was really impactful to that locker room and everything, which is like kind of like, okay, Crowder says something, whatever. Serge Ibaka, who just wasn't good enough to play, frankly, whatever. Things start to pile up, multiple people saying it's like, okay, there was something happening there. So I think that was the bridge. And I think, with the fact that he didn't play well in the playoffs and the middle class squeeze, Crowder not having a bunch of better options and just going, well, they need this four, and I'm really the one guy who fits into that. Like, I'll come play here. I think that made sense. Beasley for vet min, I was like, no shot. I mean, I know he got benched by the Lakers, but I mean, the way he shot, like, as an offensive player, I mean, that year with the Timberwolves, he was like a 20-point-per-game guy. Like, that's not the kind of guy you usually see at this point go for vet min, especially after, he had the legal troubles, but seems like kind of made it through that and all of those restrictions and has been a productive player for a while since then. So, yeah, I didn't see that coming at all. I was very surprised and excited to see that signing for sure.
Who do you think winds up being more important to the rotation for them?
That's really hard. I mean, Crowder has a much clearer pathway to it because they always need the 4 next to Giannis at the 5. And, Khris can kind of play there, but how much do you want Khris Middleton? Because that's a grimy role, like PJ Tucker stuff. Like, you got to rebound, you got to box out, you got to set screens probably, or at least space the floor. PJ's thing was offensive rebounding. It doesn't have to be that specifically, but you got to do kind of like big guy stuff while being a switchable defender. You don't really want Khris doing all that. So that role is, I think, necessary for the Bucks to be at their best. I think their default is, okay, we're going to play with Brook and you have to push us out of it. And if you can't, we probably win. I think it's really hard to beat the Bucks when Brook is comfortable. But teams do. Teams get stretchy. Brook can't survive. Okay, now we've got X4 and Giannis and all switchable guys. And that's a whole nother killer mode for different reasons. So I think Crowder's path to being so is right there, honestly. Beasley has to kind of get through a pretty good group of wing players. I do think he has more upside in terms of, I think he could be a starter, whereas I'd be pretty shocked if Crowder was. But I think his path is less clear. He's really going to have to prove it. I think he certainly could, but I guess to answer the question and not dodge it, I will say Crowder, just because I think they need that role. And outside of like Thanasis, I mean, Bobby Portis really is not that kind of player, I don't think, although he'll be important too. But it'll be fascinating to see, I guess how different their configurations are and how different the pecking order is now that we do have a new coach here in town.
Yeah, and just overall, I was a big fan of their offseason and said as much in the pod. The only thing I didn't like is like you had the ability, in theory, to keep Javon Carter, and I thought it was pretty important. I'd make more of a stink about that. The second apron stuff, I'm just pay it. Like, you're good enough to just pay it, and you're limited enough already on the trade stuff. And they get, at least for this year, it's next year when they really kick in. It's like, oh, you can't trade like the future first. If he was more of like a ball handler, playmaker type, I would have made a bigger stink. It's funny. I agree with you on Beasley Crowder overall, that Beasley might even have a better chance to start. On most teams, I might say Crowder is actually probably better suited to play the 3 because he's just not a 3 anymore. But on this team, I'm like, no, like Beasley probably just makes more sense for them with like Middleton, Giannis, and Brook Lopez there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought they had a great offseason. The thing that I wasn't on the same page with, and we have not spoken in podcast form since the decision was made, what did you make of, the decision to dismiss Mike Budenholzer, and then what do you make of the hire of Adrian Grffin? And do you have like any feel or insight as to what might change with this team or what you might expect him to, instill upon like what we're seeing on the court?
I think, it was tough, obviously, 2 years after leading the Bucks to a championship for Bud to be let go. I do think their playoff offenses are just too habitually prone to shitting the bed, so to speak. I mean, it's just happened too many times, I think, in the postseason, that where, you're just scratching your head both at what the players are actually doing on the court. Some of it's clearly like Jrue Holiday has maybe been empowered a little bit too much to make decisions. I think at some points in the postseason, I think that is a pretty mild way of saying that. You certainly feel, especially for Bud, more than even you normally would, given he had a brother pass away during the playoffs. I think that certainly would be impactful to anyone, and it's of course beyond unfortunate. And I think everyone who is a worthwhile human from Bucks Twitter, sent condolences and didn't want to pile on the guy or anything like that. But there were some moments in the playoffs where the old bad habits, as well as some not calling the timeout to draw up a play late in like game 4 or game 5 when they had a shot to just win the game right there, and they end up going into overtime and losing. So there were just some bad schematic things. And I think in addition to that, it does seem like the players were looking for something different. And the fact that, Giannis was in on the coaching interviews, Giannis seems to be very involved in who he wants coaching him for this next chapter in Milwaukee. I'm not saying Giannis said fire Bud, but the fact that he's involved in this process, at least that side of the process, they did a good job, I think, distancing and saying, no, like the players didn't tell us this, which you should do as the organization. You don't want to, put that on anyone. Mm. It did seem like, it seemed like the players on the team were ready for a fresh start. This isn't reporting. This is just from like what's been out there and consuming every little scrap about this team. So I think for all of those reasons, they kind of had to. And there's just been so many moments now where it feels like there's meat on the bone for the Bucks. I think that's a pretty common takeaway, especially from people who like grind tape and everything. I know Nikias and Steve on the dunker spot love to say like, they do like one side pick and roll or something. It's like, oh, there's some spice finally. And then they don't do anything else. So I do think it was time to inject something new into the team. They feel like they got a little stale this season.
I was less of a fan of it at the beginning because I thought it kind of symbolized this organization believed there needed to be more of like a wholesale change to the team. Yeah. And they clearly didn't go about their offseason that way. And I was just very much of the mind, like, you guys would have been in the conference finals, at least, if Giannis doesn't get injured. I understand it more now. And if the fact that you went with Giannis's pick, and I would be shocked if Giannis had anything to do with Mike Budenholzer being dismissed. Yeah. I'm a little bit more comfortable. I never know how to evaluate rookie head coaches. And I agree that, like, their offense has lacked, like, we'll crib it from the dunker spot, spice. I'm just, like, with the personnel they have, like, is there a ton of room for more spice, or do they need to add elements in here? And so that's why I'm very interested what their offense actually looks like in the half court, specifically under Adrian Grffin. And I know it's been like, it was definitely, you look at touch and go in the playoffs. I think this season they ended up like, they were even 8th in half court efficiency in the playoffs. So it wasn't even just like the worst, but they were 3rd or 4th in half court offense after Middleton came back in January last year. And so, like, I don't know that there needs to be a ton of reinvention, like being better or adaptable. So I'm just very curious to see whether if we'll see that, and 2, how possible it is just given the current state of the roster as it lays.
Yeah, I don't think it's got to be like, mind-blowing basketball or anything. It just felt like there's so many possessions, I think, especially in the playoffs. And I know to a certain extent, this is just how star players work, but so much ISO, so much no-pass possessions. And it's just like, that's just not conducive to good offense. And I'm obviously a huge Giannis fan, and Khris and Jrue Holiday. Giannis ISOing against 4 set players is just not going to be the path to playing your best basketball offensively. And I'm not saying he just has to set a bunch of screens like Shaq, although that is still their best playoff offense, is Giannis screening for Khris. It's going to be hard to beat that, but doing that more and just, being a little more inventive with, instead of a straight ISO, Grayson Allen or Pat Connaughton set a pick for Giannis and then pops. Those have been really effective actions when they do it, because if you that little bit of indecision, Giannis can be at the rim. If you lose the shooter, it's a wide open 3 from a good shooter. The kind of things that we would see, and then they would kind of go away. So I think it's going to be about more consistently playing, I guess, playing to your strengths offensively, which it sounds like, like AJ Green, who was actually on our show and talked about this at Summer League, said so far it's been like more side-to-side matchup-based offensive basketball, whatever that means. I'm excited to see what that means as well. But I am encouraged that it's not just Adrian Grffin doing the offense. He's more of a defensive guy anyway. The fact that they brought in Terry Stotts and Joe Prunty to oversee the offensive side, or at least, assist with, that was really comforting to me, because I don't expect Adrian Grffin to be an outstanding offensive coach right off the bat, considering he is more of a defensive-focused guy. But I think, Stotts from his time at Portland and like being the offensive guy on the 11 Mavericks, like having someone like that. And then Prunty, I think it brings a lot of inventive play calls as well. I think that's really exciting from a coaching perspective, in terms of that's probably the best setup you could do while still getting the personable kind of coach that Giannis really resonated with, who it seems like is still focused on maintaining an elite defense. Brook Lopez coming or going was like a huge canary in the coal mine for me. They've talked about wanting to be more flexible, I think more adaptive. I think Brook could do a zone. You're probably not switching everything with him. Would they let him go? Would the price scare them away? The fact that they stayed in it and outbid to keep him, I thought also was comforting. I didn't want to see, as you mentioned, we're not doing Brook Lopez. We're going to go away from Brook. Like, to who? Like Thomas Bryant's our new starting center. And that was someone I was like, that'd be a good backup option, I guess, if he goes. That's way worse, dude. Sorry, Thomas Bryant, but that's way worse.
Thomas Bryant still had my favorite recent trade request. They're just like, Thomas Bryant demands trade last season to the Nuggets. So based off what we know about Grffin, would you expect Grayson Allen to still be the 5th starter here, or could you see him going in sort of a different direction here, where I think it's, I don't know why you would go from Grayson Allen to Malik Beasley at this point. Like, Allen had the better shooting season. And I got killed by Bucks fans when I said, like, I don't know if I had Grayson Allen in trade, but when Malik Beasley was on his heater, I wanted the Bucks to trade for Malik Beasley. Allen's better defensively than Beasley at this point. I think it kind of feels like, it's going to be Allen or Connaughton here. Do you think that we should just pencil in Allen there, or could you see Griffin kind of mixing? Could you see him even mixing it up on like a matchup basis with that spot?
I don't know. It's not a good answer. I would pencil in Grayson for now, but certainly pencil and not pen. I think Eric Name, who covers the Bucks for The Athletic, does a great job. Shared, I think it was him or maybe it was Frank Madden, someone on the Bucks beat of some extent, shared like the numbers with like, I think it was like the big three and Lopez, or the core four, so to speak, the big three and Brook and Pat Connaughton. And the numbers have just always been really good. And I think Pat is a very good complementary player to those four. I think he certainly has a chance. It did seem like, for whatever reason, Bud just liked having him as the bench guy. Maybe something was staggering. He would be a fill-in starter occasionally, but he never really got an extended, like, okay, Pat's the fifth starter. It wouldn't shock me if that's what they decide to go with. I do think his game is a little more refined than we've gotten to see offensively. Like, he's done some intriguing, like, short roll stuff when he sets screens, but it'll be like 2 possessions at a time and then it's gone. So I think he's got a shot. He didn't have a good regular season. He had another outstanding postseason for Milwaukee. I think he's got an opportunity. I think Beasley does too. I do think to a certain extent, with a whole new staff coming in, there is going to be more opportunity for a shakeup than really any season since Bud first got there. I also think, though, like Grayson probably makes the most sense because he's such a good shooter. He's young. He is a better defender than people think. I do think he's just so underrated as a player because he had that horrible series against Boston. And he looked so much better at the things he was bad at this season. Like physically, he looked a lot stronger, I think. Not a lot, but like functionally, he wasn't getting pushed around as much. He got in the paint a little bit more. Of course, then the time expires on him in the Heat series. He should have never had the ball in that situation.
Yeah,
anyway,
I like laughing image of that series.
Yeah, everything was just a mess in that series. So I don't hold that against him. But I think he's just a good player.
You knew Bud was gone. Probably it was like Grayson Allen can't have the ball.
Just like eyes wide open, like, oh no, man, this is bad. So I think Grayson makes the most sense, but I think like someone like Pat or Beasley, or I don't really know who else would make sense to push him. I mean, does MarJon have an outstanding training camp? I wouldn't bet on that.
I love me some MarJon Beauchamp.
Oh, well, we have to talk about MarJon in a couple of questions. I do think he'll factor in a lot more this season.
Ooh, that excites me. I have a follow-up question to this. On a scale, I'm only asking it this way because I was listening to the, I think it was the most recent one you did, or maybe the previous one before that talked about Giannis's knee, and you didn't really talk about Giannis's knee. It was just like, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned do the Bucks need to be about that Giannis left knee since it's preventing him from playing in the World Cup? Or is that strictly just sort of this preventive measure? He made it sound like it wasn't. And so it's just like anytime an injury crops up, but this dude's like a top 3 player at worst, a top 3 player in the league. And so you have to just, in the back of your mind, just wonder, or is it just, no, like business as usual? He's going to go through the offseason. He'll be fine.
I would say 3 or 4. I'm not super concerned. It sounds like he'll be fine for training camp. The fact that, he pushed so hard to even play in the World Cup still is actually almost a positive. I mean, obviously it would be better if he could have played, although Giannis having a real full offseason is kind of rare at this point. So Bucks fans were kind of like, sit this one out. And I think the Bucks fans were like, yeah, you should. And I understand, these guys, especially non-Americans, really want to play for their teams. And Giannis is certainly no exception. But I think it was probably the right call for him coming off of that knee scope. Honestly, it's more wild that he hasn't had that thing cleaned up previously. I mean, some of the reporting after the finals, like they wanted him to wear this special brace. He wouldn't wear it. I think he said at one point, I was one bad fall away from like catastrophe. Like, geez, like he's always got knee soreness that holds him out here and there. I think just like being that literal freak of nature is taxing on anyone's knees. So I think we all were kind of like, yeah, he's probably got to have something done at some point, right? So I think the fact that he got it done early, he tried to play a World Cup but couldn't. No one's too worried, I don't think, from the Bucks side. I think it's just we've all come to kind of accept that Giannis's knees are going to be an ongoing thing to monitor. And so far, knock on all the wood, he's been able to avoid. I had to make sure I didn't wake my dog up. She's good. He's been able to avoid missing a lot of time. And as long as that's the case, if he misses a week here, whatever, that's just like fine. That's a fair trade-off for being able to do what he does at his size and weight.
I think some people will interpret this follow-up question the wrong way. And it's really just because we know so much about Giannis. We've talked about his counters. what else he can do on offense, everything he does on defense. Have you given any thought, just because he is entering his age 29 season, about what his game will look like as it ages, maybe any changes or adaptations that he would make?
How dare you?
Well, yeah, just because he's approaching. I say this as a 34-year-old, and it's just so it's so stupid. Where it's like he's getting older, and it's like he's still 4 years younger than I am.
Yeah, I've thought for a while now. He's probably should have his back to the basket a little more. I think that's what makes the most sense. Given his level of skill physically and how carefully he can move. I think that could be a really logical transition to, maybe even being a full-time 5 at one point, but at least offensively, playing that role where even if you have someone like a Brook Lopez to do some of the more dirty work, especially defensively, down low all the time, but being able to create offense for yourself and others from like the elbow. And Giannis's post game it's gotten a little better over the years. It doesn't seem like it's been a huge focus for him. He is kind of known for doing like one thing per offseason he really locks in on. Like he got better at finishing, like just driving to the basket, avoiding contact. I'd say like a year or two ago was really big. He used to always get charges. He's definitely gotten a lot better at that. It wouldn't surprise me if like a year, 2 years, maybe even a little further down the line, he comes back and he's like suddenly posting up like 5 times a game or something. And to be clear, like for people who think, oh, he's doing all these like ISOs right now, I would look at that as functionally different. Like, yeah, he attacks the paint all the time. I'm talking about starting the possession back to the basket 14 feet out and creating from there. That's what we don't see as much. It wouldn't surprise me. I don't think he's going to leap into it before he has to stop relying on, everything else he can do. But that's, to me, what makes the most sense.
I would agree. Are you panicking uncontrollably knowing that he probably won't sign an extension this summer?
No. The funny thing is, super loyal guy has not been shy to put pressure on the Bucks. I think that's always just going to be there. And it's I think just easier if you just assume they've got a good shot at keeping him if you continue to do everything you can to compete for a championship and the team is competitive, which obviously means at some point here there's a lot of pressure to find new co-stars, clearly. But right now, I think, they're still favored to be at the top of the East, and they have a shot, and I think in anyone's esteem to win a title again. I think as long as that's the case, they're in a pretty good pole position there with Giannis. But no, I'm not expecting him to sign the extension early. I wouldn't surprise me if he dragged it out a bit again. Giannis, as he's joked about with his ad deals and everything, likes to lock in the money. So I do think he's going to tack on 4 or 5 years at some point when it financially makes sense to do so. I don't think he's going to rush to do it, though. He's one of those players where clearly, even if something horrible happened, somebody would sign him for a whole lot of money again. So not really any risk from his perspective. I do think he'll stick around for a while, but he's not usually been one to at the earliest pop. I mean, when he signed the Supermax, it was like right before the season. Like they were in camp. It was pretty nervy, to be honest. I wouldn't be surprised if something like that happened again. And if it was tied to, like it was last time, a crucial move for the future. I mean, if you remember, it was soon after they got Jrue Holiday, and I do think it was very much like all right, you have to go do something, and if you prove it and you can do it, then I'll sign up. I wouldn't be shocked if it was like the similar situation, but just with now, the Jrue Holiday who's half a decade or a decade younger than current Jrue Holiday.
I would say I agree that there's a level of like, don't sign the extension. You have to continue to put pressure on the organization. But I also look at it as just like, it makes more sense because he can tack on more years.
Also,
like, just gonna wait. And like, that's the other thing here. So I can't bring myself to care about it. I know it's been a talking point elsewhere. Is there any, as we stick with sort of the injury theme, Khris Middleton comes back in, it was like January 23rd, I think it was last year, shoots like, does not look okay on defense for pretty much the rest of the season. But his offense, like, it returned. He shot like 1,000,000,000% on like his turnaround fadeaways after he returned the second time. The Bucks, like I said, their half-court offense ranked in 4th overall, and it was just like lights out, I think, when he was sharing the floor with all of Milwaukee's key players. Is there any lingering concern about how that knee injury might impact him this year, or is it very much just like, oh, he gets to go through a healthy offseason? Like, this is great.
I think it's more that, and I think if anything, funny enough, given all the news around this other player, maybe he just needs to be used in different roles defensively for so long. And he was so good at this. Like, I'll never forget the good Heat series for Milwaukee. He was flying around with Duncan Robinson and around screens, and he really did that role to perfection in that series. I think that's a large reason of why they were able to win that so well. A lot of things went to that, and they've kind of kept him as more of a perimeter defender. I almost think that you would hope certainly he looks a little better just mobility-wise from the healthy offseason finally, which he clearly needed. Another guy who had, I think, a knee cleaned up earlier this year.
He was moving the way that Brook Lopez looks like he should move.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Brook Lopez just doesn't move. Like, he's like super balletic and like really good at his low stances for a big man. It was just like, he looked so, I don't know what the word is, like so rigid.
Yeah, he did.
It felt like.
So you certainly hope he's just going to be a little more fluid. I mean, Khris is not ancient. He's in his early 30s. So that's the hope that there's more there. But also I think, like, do you just give him the Harden treatment defensively? I mean, he's big. He's 6'7". Like, just put him on slower guys and then say, if you want to post up Khris, fine, or run at him. Like, you just can't use him as that premier defensive player anymore, which is a little more palatable when you have Jrue Holiday and I think good to okay players defensively coming off the bench. And, is Giannis going to be more involved defensively and less just off ball all the time? I think some of the answers he gave to wanting to guard Jimmy Butler last playoffs makes me believe maybe he'll just be involved more defensively going forward. That, of course, then opens up a lane for, okay, the guys who Giannis was guarding and ignoring, maybe Khris can do some of that more to some extent and not take on the kind of assignments where he has to be as mobile. Of course, you can get players into actions. You can never totally hide a guy. But I do wonder, maybe he has to play some more 4-ish kind of elements, both on offense and defense going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting on the defensive side, because then it would make a lot of sense too. And I don't know if they're going to be more inclined to try like Giannis as the lone big lineups because Brook Lopez is getting older. How many minutes can he handle? But like the easiest way or the most effective way to maybe get Middleton there is, okay, well, if Portis is on the court, Giannis is off, go with Jay Crowder, Middleton. I think that gives you the most flexibility then as like your 3-4 combo, or do that, of course, with Giannis on the floor, even if it's, Brook without Giannis, like that might be the most effective way to get Khris Middleton to in that. No, you don't want him, as you mentioned already earlier, you don't want him to be sort of your every possession but to have the option to kind of futz and fiddle with him in that context.
Yeah, finding those wing players who are not going to be the most taxing assignments, we'll say, especially the ones who maybe just spend a lot of time sitting in corners, which ironically, some of the players Giannis has the most defensive gaffes guarding because he'll look to the ball and kind of creep away and give up those shots. Like some of those assignments to Khris, maybe. Obviously, Giannis also will wreck your world defensively if you don't account for him. But it wouldn't surprise me if they shifted around things like that a little bit as well, for sure.
Do you have any thoughts on their inbound rookies, Andre Jackson and Chris Livingston? And also, this is kind of the more important question, is like, so Javon Carter leaving and just looking at their backup playmaker situation, do we just expect AJ Green or maybe even Jackson to play a potentially real semi-meaningful role for this team?
I was pretty high on Andre Jackson Jr. playing real minutes, seeing him as a prospect after they drafted him. I didn't try to cover the 500 players who could go, and they only had like pick 15-8 going in, so they traded up and got him. But he looked into him as a player, thought this is exactly what they need. I mean, I kind of wrote it off or blew it off and was proven wrong. I do think they were too old last year, and I think it really showed. Like Joe Ingles and Wes Matthews and the already aging core around Giannis, they had just a lot of old guys in the rotation. I think getting younger is good long-term, even if some of these guys aren't quite ready to play full roles right away. Like losing Wes hurt. I think they had to. They just had to get younger. They had to give other guys that role. He was still so good at his role in the playoffs, man. I'll always root for Wes Matthews. But I thought Andre Jackson could play a role. Did not have a good summer league at all. I do think part of the reason is they just had horrible spacing as a team, as many do in summer league, and just no flow. And he's a player who would really benefit from like real spacing because of his lack of shooting. Mm-hmm. It was just a huge problem, though. I mean, teams dared him to shoot. I think he made maybe one like the whole summer league. The shot looks really bad. I think they need to rebuild it from the ground up. And I've gotten some blowback from saying I don't view him as a point guard. I do think he's like a ball moving wing, more of a like maybe a little bit Dante, but like a Gary Payton. GP2, the mitten kind of player who it's like, that guy doesn't really initiate the action. Like, he keeps the action moving. That's what I view him as long term. Bruce Brown is a better, like, that would be pretty aspirational. If he was anything like Bruce Brown, the shooting has to go a long way. So I think it really depends, like, how he fits early on. I thought Livingston actually impressed me. I thought he was going to be years away based on what I heard about him. I thought he looks like physically like a real NBA wing already. He just needs some refining. Wouldn't surprise me if he made the rotation before Andre Jackson, at least in spurts, because I do think he's closer. I don't think either are particularly close, though, especially because they're still just a pretty deep team overall. The players that we could go through, let's say the starting five, as we laid out, is Jrue, Khris, Grayson, flip them, but whatever. Giannis, Brook, and then we know Pat Connaughton and Bobby Portis are going to play a lot. Let's assume Jay Crowder and Malik Beasley play a lot, too. That's already 9, I think. So then MarJon Beauchamp, AJ Green, rookies, like, they're not all going to play every night. I don't know Adrian Grffin yet. I don't think he's going to have a 13-man rotation every game. That would be pretty Budenholzer-esque of him in the early days. So I don't think they're going to play big roles early. I think they'll get chances, and we'll just kind of see. But I wouldn't expect either of them to play. And funny enough, John Horst called out Lindell Wigginton, their two-way player.
I was about to say, I know you said you caught shit for what you said about Jackson. I honestly view Lindell Wigginton as like the only possible, not that he would play, backup point guard on the roster. He's not even really technically on the roster. He's on a two-way. Yeah. So, like, I don't know. I know a little bit about his past. Like, I don't know really anything about him. And I don't know anything about the rookies that are coming, like, nothing. And AJ Green specifically, I just question whether he's going to be enough of a ball mover to run, like, these methodical sets. But yeah, please continue. I was like, I'm looking at this like, like Lindell's like kind of like no one they have to an actual backup point guard.
And John Horst said, he thought he could take some role. I think the more logical conclusion is, they'll just operate with one and then, have other guys move the ball and incorporate Giannis and Khris more. But, if Jrue misses time, which, based on the last few years, probably here and there, he'll miss some. I do bet Lindell will get called up and be asked to move the ball a bit as a bench player. I do think he's come a long way. So his first year with the Herd, he was like their defensive assignments guy for a 6'1" guard. Like, he took on a lot of the top guard defenders. So he's a good defender. Like Javon, he plays a lot of press. And then year 2, he wasn't able to hit shots previously. Last year, he shot the ball really well at the G League level, at 40+%. So really has grown as a player. I do think they'll give him some run too. But, didn't have an amazing summer league, played okay, didn't get to play a bunch. It's going to be fascinating, though, because I do think Bucks fans really want them to skew younger. I think they all realize, okay, what's the future of the team here? I think we'll probably have to bring in someone from outside eventually to be a new co-star, pending MarJon. But, you need role players too. I have to include that. But you need role players too. And the team was really just like, is it going to be Wes and Ingles again next year? How are they going to look in the playoffs after a long season? Even Crowder's not young anymore. So I do think Bucks fans want to see these young guys play more. Especially MarJon, AJ Green for sure, who I think was like a diamond in the rough find for them last year, and the rookies to a certain extent, although they won't all be able to play every game at all.
I also think what they could try, and we didn't see a ton of it last year, and we've seen more of it in the past, is like when you're staggering your stars, like when Khris Middleton leads the non-Jrue, non-Giannis minutes, like if you want to tether Jrue and Giannis together a little bit more, I think he's like fully capable of just like you have the like he can be your backup point guard technically. Yeah, like he's fully capable. I think he's that good. So MarJon Beauchamp. Let's get to MarJon Beauchamp. What type of role? Do you have any impressions from his rookie year you're dying to get off his chest? And what are you watching most closely with him entering year 2 and 3? Do you expect them to give him like a shake at? Like we said, it feels like they have 9 locks, and that spoils the 10-man rotation we build at the end. Like, do you just sort of pencil him in as like that? Oh, they're going to give him a fair shake at being that regular 9th or maybe even 10th guy.
I do think that. So I look at MarJon almost like you hear, I don't know if you consume any of this content, like football analysts, they always talk about traits. That's what I look at with MarJon. And there were so many bad sloppy plays year 1 for him. But the good stuff, it was like, oh, wow. Like if he can get to what he can do more consistently, that's a difference-making player for the Bucks. And I think one is athleticism. This was like going along with the age thing. Even though like Ingles and Wes Matthews, those kind of guys still played well, even in their peaks, well, especially Wes, post-Achilles, of course, not jumping out of the gym. And I think the Bucks suffered from that. Their transition offense was just not very good last year, I think, for most, if not all, of the season. And there was a lot of head scratching, like, is this random variance? Like, how can a team with Giannis not be good in transition? The answer is, if you put 3 guys on Giannis going down the court, it's just going to be threes. Like, that's all that's going to happen, because if Giannis doesn't get to the rim, nobody else is running with him. Like, all he can do is pass out to the perimeter for a 3, which is a good shot. But, they were, I think, dominant earlier years when they had more athleticism around him. And there were some fast breaks where you would kind of see, like, the defenses, it's funny to watch, like, kind of glom toward Giannis. And then he throws it ahead, and it's like, oh, someone's actually behind us. Beauchamp beat everyone back, and he just gets to dunk it or whatever. And it's like, oh, we've kind of not really had that for a long time. It kind of sneaks up on you how little athleticism was on the roster. He handles the ball. In Summer League, his big thing this year was tough finishes. Like, he had like 6 and ones, I think, in Summer League, which is pretty outrageous for how much he actually played. A lot of finishing through contact. Or at least fall, but I think it was and ones. It was a ton of finishing through other wing players around the basket and even some bigs. And that wasn't really something we saw. Year 1, he traveled all the time. Like 1 per game, at least, he would travel. I don't know if he did any, maybe 1 in Summer League, so hopefully that's been a focus for him, because that's pretty hard to be a sustainable offensive player when you travel once, twice a game. But you can see the athleticism. The shooting comes and goes with MarJon. That's going to be huge to iron out. You just kind of assume that he'll be able to develop that. Bucks fans are hoping he does not work with lethal shooter, who Bobby Portis' shot has been pretty uneven because he's like shooting through, underwater and at triangles with nails sticking out of them. And it's like, can we just work on shooting through a normal basket, please, Bobby? We're hoping that he's done more of that this year. But I think MarJon, it's like the outline is there for him to be an impactful difference-making wing player. It's just how much of it does he get and how fast does he get there. I do think this year versus like AJ Green, those kind of options at the end of the bench, I think he'll be in line for some real role from the start. And then from there, it'll probably just depend on who's healthy, who's playing well, that sort of thing.
Feels like this oversimplifies it, but the shooting, like standstill shooting, will be a swing skill in terms of Kenny Hang in the rotation. And it felt like he knew where he needed to be, like when he was running in transition or like going in the half court as the season went on. It felt, but like you said, it is a little bit, when you're looking at shooting specifically, like there's still just too much of a like worse than a coin toss element to it. Yeah. And I would love to give him a shot because I like the physical tools are there. And as you said, they have Giannis. So this is sort of just, it's not masked on the floor, but it's masked in like the discussions that we have. The team is just not athletic. Yeah. Like overall, like from top to bottom, like you have Giannis. So you have that infusion of athleticism, but to have someone like MarJon on the court, if you can like you said, if you think he has like some of a floor game where you can at least trust him to attack open closeouts in the half court, that goes a long way to what this team would be able to do offensively then too.
Yeah, and I think, looking at their rookies, and even like Amari Moore, they didn't draft, but he was like right after the draft, they signed him to a 2-way as well. All pretty athletic guys. And I think even there was a former Bucks staffer who tweeted or X'd right after the draft, or right after the Andre Jackson Jr. pick. Like, this is just not a guy they would have considered in the old regime. Like, you had to shoot, right? It was the Sam Merrill kind of picks. And even Jordan Nwora, who, not a little more athletic, but certainly like, okay, he can light it up shooting the ball. Like, that's pretty much all they did for a long time around Giannis. And of course, shooting is important. I do think, though, looking back, and it's easy to buy into this now. Let's see how they look this year. But I do think looking back, it is easy to say maybe they over-indexed on that one skill, and it left them with too many players who had incomplete games. And I think that leans into, like, Miami having so much success against them, because if the shots aren't falling and Miami contests everything, their whole roster will go at the guy in front of them and try and, like, out-physical them to an extent where the Bucks, I think, weren't as comfortable with that.
What is the either biggest concern or swing factor, potential development, curiosity about this team you'll be monitoring to start next year?
I mean, just what the offense looks like is going to be a big one. I know we've talked about it already, but, specifically what they do. Also, I think one that I was thinking about more recently that I hadn't thought of before is like, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, what does the rotation look like in terms of minutes? We've always seen such to a degree of saving the guys, right? Like so responsible minute allocations. And of course, Adrian Grffin coming from Toronto, I mean, Nick Nurse was the one, I think, making those decisions, but Toronto's the polar opposite, right? I mean, Siakam and Anunoby and these guys are leading the league in minutes or close to it. It's like them and the Tibbs guys are like the whole top 10, it felt like. So will they play a little more? I don't think they'll go extreme. I mean, I do think organizationally they're still focused on the playoffs more than anything. And I mean, they were the 1 seed in the East last year. It's not like, you know, they had an issue winning games with that allocation, but that I'm interested to see. All of the little things that are just changed that you don't really realize when a new coach comes in. I mean, this is a minor one, but I do think it's going to make Bucks fans' lives a little better day to day through the season. Actually hearing from the head coach what's going on or real insight to the team, which I would say in like the 4 times we've heard from Adrian Grffin, we've gotten more than, you know, the last 6 months of Budenholzer, which again, it's, you know, it doesn't make him a better or worse coach, but certainly in terms of covering it as a fan, it is kind of nice to get some actual insight and hear things where, you know, the Bucks before, and I think this is another organizational thing too, but we just got so little most of the time. It would be refreshing if there was a little bit more insight gleaned as well onto what's going on. But really just how they approach it on both ends schematically. I wonder, will they play more zone? I think that to me is a sweet spot between switching up the defense and not going too far away from Brook. Because I think you can still use Brook in a zone as that middle guy in a zone or back line of a zone.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's something I wonder, like, could that be really potent if they had like a, you know, something like a 1-3-1? Like put Giannis at the top of the zone or in the middle of it, Brook in the back, and then just defenders on all sides who can dig into the nail and get back out to their guy. Like, is that just a nightmare to work against? And is that something they've underexplored? I don't know. I'm not a schematic genius or anything, but I'm interested to see that kind of stuff too. Like, how do they find other ways to use Brook? Because we know what he can drop. We know that for sure.
Oh,
what else can he do?
Are you sure?
Yeah, I think he's solid. I think he can manage it. If he's not too old. But that's what I'm excited about, just seeing all the new wrinkles and how they work and all of that stuff.
If I set the over-under on Giannis's minutes per game, to touch upon your first part of this answer, at 33.2, are you taking the over or the under?
I'd still take the under.
He is logged over the past 5 years, 32.3 minutes is his average. So that would seem to be the smart call, is to take the under. I don't know. He comes from Toronto. I might take the over on that, but then... That kind of part of this is, by the way, like they don't need Giannis to play 35 minutes to win 58 games. They just won 58 games with Giannis playing like 32 and change.
Yeah, and missing a bunch of games too, which will probably happen again as well.
So, yeah, maybe I'm just going to take the over just for some variability's sake. But I just look at it, I'm like, this team just won 58 games. And as you said, he missed time. He didn't have to be logged a whole ton of minutes. He might need to log less. If he plays in more games, he might be at 31 just because they're going to be run away from some of these teams.
That's the hope.
Oh, yeah. Oh, were you going to say something? Sorry.
No, I just said that's the hope.
So, would it be fair to say after this offseason that the Bucks feel like they're deliberately operating within this 2 or 3 year window when you start to look at when the contracts of, sure, Lopez, but specifically like Middleton and Holiday and Giannis contract as of right now, and even Bobby Portis, all kind of expiring around the same 1 to 1 year time. Is that kind of where you think that they're at?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's all you can do.
Clear, just for anyone who might miss. I'm not saying, they're planning on Giannis leaving in 2 to 3 years. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm just talking about this core specifically. I know you know that. I just don't. I don't want to piss off anybody.
Yeah. I think definitely. I think that's all you can do given what they have around here. And I'll do the worst case first, so I can end with the better one. If Giannis were to, with 1 year left, demand a trade. That's, again, I'm not anticipating this either, please God. But in that worst case scenario where hopefully, or he just walks, which that sucks, you don't get anything. But if he wants out with a year left or gets signed and traded or whatever, do you want this whole core on these long contracts for a long time past then? Maybe you could say, you can trade those guys and get something. I mean, we'll see how everyone ages. I certainly think they'll all age pretty well. But, if Khris signs for 5 years instead of 3, or Brook signs for 4 or 5 years, or, Jrue extends right now for a long time, or, you bring back Ingles at a big dollar amount or whatever it is. Like, I think they have their out in the worst case. And in the best case, it's also like they have a lot of flexibility in terms of, maybe you're not as interested in trading for Khris if his money goes through 2032 or not 2032, but 2029 or whatever it is versus where it is now. And same with Brook and Jrue to a certain extent. And I do think when you look at where their pivot could happen. I mean, this could be another 1 year window where they just sign for longer than that because, you don't want everyone expiring again. It's just a mess, clearly. But on draft day 24, assuming they duck under the second apron next year, which maybe the Javon thing could have factored in, this could have factored into the Javon thinking. On draft day, I think they'll have 3 total future firsts they can trade. They'll have 2 in the future and then 1 that they just picked, which is way more than they've had since the Jrue trade. Like, this is basically the first time they've gotten back to that many. And I do think looking at, the quality of players they don't just have empty calorie dollars. Like, any player they're trading pending a change in this next 12 months is a real player. You're getting at least good value, I think, on the contract, plus 3 firsts, plus some seconds, whatever else they have. MarJon, these rookies, whoever looks good potentially. I think they could really get in the mix for trading for next disgruntled star who wants to play there. And I think we'll see. I think there'll always be better offers. No one's competing with OKC, right? But I think they'll be in the mix. And that's what interests me is, can they find that move next year? And then you make the case to Giannis. We've got your next guy. He's in his late 20s too, or mid to late 20s, or just close at that point, early 30s compared to mid 30s, like Khris and Jrue will be basically by then. I think that's what they have to look for. They have to have a pivot because clearly Giannis is not going to be wanting 35, 36, 37-year-old Khris Middleton as his second best player his whole rest of his career, as much as he likes Khris. So I would say 3 windows would even maybe be long for this core. I think before that point, they'll be looking to find someone to come in. And, I mean, they sniffed around Bradley Beal, which I thought, and that was reported multiple times. Like, they really looked into that. Probably would have taken Jrue Holiday to get that done salary-wise.
Yeah, the money for sure.
And, I mean, they were right there. I think they were trying to do it and win him over. Like, I think they're clearly focused on finding that next co-star, that perimeter player. And it would surprise me if they didn't figure out something before like 2 or 3 years from now.
I guess what gets difficult for them is because of how punitive you are going to be if you're in the luxury tax, and this is not a team that's going to be cheap, is you have to be like on the money, basically, with dollar for dollar going out, and you have to make sure that you're not in a position to where any of your first round picks are off the market, like the 7 years out one. And that's why I think what's interesting, and this was kind of my question, is how committed are they to this core if the opportunity arises to, let's say, this season or even next season by the 2025 trade deadline, trade a first-round pick or technically 2, depending on how many open up, like what timeline we're talking about, versus waiting the 2 or 3 years so that you can open up more to trade for maybe a higher-end player. But do you think that they're committed enough to this core to where if I don't want to use it as more of an odds and end, but if it's more of a finishing touch than it is someone who sets themselves up for the post Jrue Middleton phase of the Giannis era, are they committed enough to this window to make that call, which they could have to, like, that's just an opportunity that could arise tomorrow. Yeah, it won't, but it's probably an issue close to the trade deadline. But are they committed enough to make that decision now?
I would be a little surprised. I think it would have to be someone they felt was just the perfect fit. I think the last time they traded a first was PJ, and clearly that worked out. So I wouldn't rule it out. But I think their preferred line will be the Crowder thing again, where it's like, we've cobbled together 5 second-round picks. We will spend those. We don't want to part with the first-round pick. And I think they don't have as many right now, but it wouldn't surprise me, like, is there someone on the roster who ends up getting flipped to open up space later who, maybe wants to play more? We've seen that happen every year or two, it feels like. We'll see on that. But I would guess they'll try to save the first, because I do think you trade your future first this year, then it's like, okay, you have a kid, you probably drafted it like in the 20s, we'll say, and 1 future first. It just gets a lot harder to make that move, especially, the second apron thing, they're pretty close to ducking it now. We actually thought they'd be under, but the unlikely bonuses put them over. But if you're in unlikely bonus range, you're not that far from it. So, like, I think they could get under it next year.
5 under it without the unlikely bonuses or something?
Yeah, so I think they're, like, post-Thanasis, I think they're, like, just over. Because they did fill the 15th spot, which I didn't really expect.
I forgot about TA.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I can't forget TA. And speaking of, no one having could TA have a real role this year? I think it's possible. Every year? Yeah.
And I think the response is the same. It's possible. Look, there was other interest in TA, apparently, which is really funny if people still think like, oh, we're going to put ourselves in the Giannis sweepstakes, but like we want TA on the roster for it.
Do you think that's what it was? It had to be, right?
The fact that the Knicks were interested in him is a 100% what it was.
Yeah. Okay. And I was like, I had to look up. Did he like attend 1 day of classes at Villanova? No, I don't think so. I don't know why else. That's all they go off of lately. But no, I think they'll try to hold the first, but I mean I would say they are a bird in the hand versus the Bush organization, knowing, okay, this is prime Giannis we're talking about. I mean, if there was like a plus role player, especially one who fit age-wise, I wouldn't be stunned if they did it for sure. I don't think they'd do it for like Bojan Bogdanovic.
Right. So would we be in agreement that it seems like their biggest need is like another shot creator type, not even just strictly a backup point guard, but like another shot creator type for this roster? And would you expect them to, regardless of what assets they're going to put on the table, make some sort of a move, whether it's the buyout market, trying to cobble together enough ancillary assets to add that player? I know a lot of that's dependent on, well, what do they look like during the regular season, but we've also seen how they've struggled in past years during the playoffs, and you are sort of at I would say a secondary deficit in that department. Yeah. You're going outside the starting lineup. Would you expect them to at least do something like that, even if it's not the bigger swing? I know Bucks fans, you told me, were obsessed with Jordan Clarkson at one point.
Yeah. It's funny. I think they probably will. I don't think it's for sure. And I think one of my takeaways from this last postseason run was, like, Ingles was actually a very good offensive backup point guard for them. Like, moved the ball really well. Had a great pick and roll with Brook Lopez. But you get to the playoffs, and you have Giannis, and you have Jrue Holiday, and you have Khris Middleton. He didn't touch the ball much. Like, when he played, like, he was kind of just a floor spacer, and it was frustrating. But also, I was kind of like, I mean, how much can you really tell those three guys? Like, you're just going to be off ball when you're on the court for X number of playoff minutes because we have Joe Ingles. And I do wonder, I think that's the hard part with adding another perimeter player. Regular season, yeah, sure, you can't get enough. I think they'll miss it, and maybe that's where we'll see someone like even Lindell get some run. But it's hard to slot in a role player, ball handler, on a team that really has three, to some extent, ball handlers. I mean, Jrue Holiday is their point guard for as much as, the decision-making and everything. Like, he's going to handle the ball. He's had 10 assist games in the playoffs. Khris is their best pick-and-roll initiator. You try telling Giannis Antetokounmpo he's not going to handle the ball at all either. There is only so much other, and I think it's hard for a guy to come in and just, like, prove that he deserves to be on the ball, unless you're like, could you find he's obviously gone and too expensive. But, if Chris Paul comes in, that's a different story. If you find Mike Conley,
never know.
That would be. Bucks fans have been flirting with that one since pre-Jrue. I mean, that was the only thing we thought we could do before. No one thought Jrue Holiday was going to be on the way there. And probably would have worked out well for a couple of years there. But I would be down for that as well if he wants to show up. But I think it would have to be someone like that who's more of an established point guard versus just like, a good initiator. I would worry they would just lose their role in the playoffs again, which I think makes some sense. But then it's like, well, what was the acquisition for? Are we really doing this for the regular season? Is it worth it? Or, do we just give the rookies and Lindell Wigginton the ball more? MarJon, you're a point guard today. Figure it out. We don't care. We're playing, who's really not? We're playing Washington. Like, we don't care at all. It's like, we're going to win anyway, probably. Go see what you can do. Maybe not an in-season tournament game. That's a different story. But, I don't know. So that's what I grapple with, right? Is like, if you're not bringing in let's say, like, not even starter, but like a top rotational guy, like where Bobby Portis is at, but as a point guard. If it's not that level of player, I do wonder, like, is it worthwhile? Do you really need it for the playoffs or not? What do you think about? I want your take on this because it's a weird idea, I think.
You stole my vibe a little bit. You didn't steal it. We're just on the same wavelength here. Is if you're not, and that's what makes the conversation about would they give up the first round pick and what I was going to get into. I would say they're at a similar point. I mean, other teams are here, but a good analog is the Knicks right now. The Bucks are way better than the Knicks. I want to make that clear. But everyone's talking about like, oh, the Knicks could do this, they could do that. It's like any move you make at this point needs to be someone that it can be added to your closing lineup, or I think the great way of framing it, I was going to say your sixth best player is, can it be on the level of Bobby Portis? Where, okay, he's not in your most important closing units, but like, he's going to play enough minutes to matter. And the Bucks are in that same situation where they have kind of we have that fifth spot on the perimeter open in the closing lineup. Like, okay, you need to be better than whoever you have. It's not just a matter of, well, let's go get this player who maybe they're even better than Grayson Allen or Pat Connaughton, but you can't play them defensively in crunch time, or they're too on the ball. Like, I would argue, like, could you play? Let's say you were able to get Jordan Clarkson. like, could you play him in your closing unit? I guess in theory, sure.
You probably should.
You're asking a lot of Middleton because Jrue Holiday is already handling all he can. And so, like, that's just going to trickle down onto your 3 effect. And that's where the Bucks are at, which makes it so difficult, is that any move, they don't have necessarily the assets right now to do it, but they need to make, if they're going to make a move, a meaningful move, it has to be more higher end than mid end. And that's where I think I compare the Knicks, because when people were talking about their offseason and some people were underwhelmed by them getting Dante DiVincenzo, you needed to get someone. Your biggest need is shooting that for the Knicks that cracks your closing lineup. And for the Bucks, it's that 5th guy who can be in our closing lineup. The bar for that, because you're already so good, is incredibly high. And when you know Brook, Giannis, Jrue, and Middleton are just going to play a crap ton of minutes in the playoffs anyway, the bar becomes even higher for that. And so I think that's the issue, given their, a team like the Knicks, they have more assets to give up and go out and get, and also their baseline of talent is lower as the collective. But when you don't have these assets, you almost need to, you mentioned this, wait, and as more of these first-round picks open up that you can trade, that makes it easier to get what you need, as ass backwards as that might sound, of knowing the immediacy that you need to approach the Giannis window with.
But it is a funny paradox, because it's a good problem to have. I would put it like they have a depth chart hole, but they don't have a roster hole. If you just stack up and look at these are our 9 most talented players, I don't think anyone would look at that group, a skill set aside, and go, oh, they need to add to that. I think their top 9 is really good, so it's difficult. I don't think you should go get a let's say DeLon Wright, a fine backup point guard, right? I don't think you should go get a DeLon Wright and then go, well, Pat, you're not playing as much tonight because we went and got DeLon Wright. I'm not specifically saying DeLon Wright is way worse than Pat Connaughton or whatever, but just to make the point of you shouldn't push better players down in the rotation just to fill that hole, which skill set wise may not matter that much anyway, given what some other players on the roster can do. And that's why it is everyone wants to trade Grayson on Bucks Twitter now. I think it's really hard to trade Grayson and get better. I don't see the 1-to-1 trade for a team. It's just yeah, we're going to give you another player in their late 20s who's just better for some reason, and you don't have to give us up much. And they make the same amount somehow, which Grayson makes $9 million, which is not a lot. Everyone wanted Colin Sexton. It's okay, even putting aside the whole Colin Sexton as a player thing, you got to give up 2 rotational players and probably picks because it's Danny Ainge. Is that on its face even worth it? Seriously, that's that. I mean, you're not getting them for 2 players. The Jazz are not doing that unless it's Giannis and Khris or something.
And that's the thing too, is just they're only built to you're going to trade for salary matching purposes. You're going to end up trading one of your top 7 or 8 players. And hey, spoiler alert, it's not going to be one of your top 3.
Yeah,
it's
or
not
4,
gonna be
really.
Or Middleton. It's not going to be one of your top 4.
Yeah.
And so it needs, and if you're going to give up 2 of them, and so it's I got into this when I was who would make a lot of sense for this roster? Tyus Jones.
Yeah.
But then you get into the conversation of Tyus Jones can't close for you. Maybe he could, Tyus and Jrue and Middleton and Giannis and Brook.
It'd be matchup dependent at best.
Right. It'd be matchup dependent. And then, okay, fine. That's fine. You can fall back on Connaughton or Grayson in that respect. It's well, no, you're going to have to trade maybe one or both those guys to get Tyus Jones.
Yeah.
And that's just it's a good problem to have, but I think people lose the plot of the bar for the Bucks to make a trade is just so high for someone who's going to be, again, their 6th best player. And it has to be it has to be our 6th best player, not because we traded our 6th best player to get him, but because they were going to be better than that 6th best player to begin with. Where it's if you're going to trade Bobby Portis or Pat Connaughton, whatever, okay, it's not just this person's kind of a better fit. No, this person needs to be better than those guys too.
Yeah, I mean, because you are always needing to contend that year in addition to the looking forward stuff. And it's there were some teams, it felt like Detroit got Monty Morris super easily, and there were Bucks fans we could have done. I mean, they did. They did.
I didn't was how did they only get that second for Monte Morris? But please,
but the Bucks again, maybe that's still a worthwhile deal to do. I'm not legislating that, but the Pistons didn't have to think. I don't even remember who they sent. It was salary. They had salary that they could send. The Bucks don't.
They didn't send salary. It was just in the cap.
They just took him. They just took him. So that's even more. But some of these trades where it's John Collins. The Bucks reportedly sifted around John Collins. Of course they did, as you say. Infinitely scalable player. Would have been a great fit on the Bucks. But guess what? The Jazz, I think, did send back something for him. If I remember, maybe they had the
Rudy Gay. It was Rudy Gay.
the Bucks don't have that equivalent of like, here's $7 million that we just like, no offense to Rudy Gay, that just doesn't, we're not worried about losing that player. Like they don't also have the equivalent.
Even if you did, let's just say you had a throwaway player on a $7 million contract. Who the fuck is making $7 million like Rudy Gay's making $6 million? Like waived. So that's sort of their issue. We talked about this already, but to get it in pencil, their top 10 rotation, 9 of the spots are just it's so easy to do with this team. It's locked. There's Jrue, Grayson, Khris, Giannis, Brook as the starting 5, we'll say right now. Then Bobby Portis, Pat Connaughton, and I think both Jay Crowder and Malik Beasley are going to factor into the rotation. I would argue Malik Beasley might have the ability to be more important than Jay Crowder. He also is more likely to just fall out of the rotation completely. Like there's less of an in-between. There's less of a medium with him. Yeah. Who would we pencil in for that? Is it MarJon right now? Is it AJ Green? Who would you give that 10th spot at the moment?
I'm going to say MarJon for now. I do think and this is going to sound crazy to people, I'm not making a comparison between these two players. If Beasley did fall out, I do think that's where an AJ Green could really rise because, of course, the shooting is the main skill set for both. I think Malik has a much more refined offensive game, of course. He, for whatever it's worth, it seems like he's been in Milwaukee a ton. Like he's always posting workouts either with his team or in the Bucks facility. Clearly a player who is Bruce Brown-esque, really, really incentivized to play well this year and then hit free agency and get a real contract. Bucks probably will have a hard time holding on to him if he does have a good year. Oh, well, it's worth it getting him for a year anyway. I would pencil in MarJon first, AJ Green right there. I think it's a little bit of a gap between them and the 2 rookies and, Thanasis and Robin Lopez, depending on if one of those rookies is tearing it up in camp. Sure. I mean, there's, they could climb it, but I think right now that's the, MarJon. And really AJ Green played better, I would say, last year, but I think MarJon will get first crack if I had to guess.
The most galaxy brain thing I thought about the Bucks this year was when they brought back Rolo. And I understand they're not the same player. I was like, are they just going to be more open to trade Bobby Portis at the trade deadline? Like they had just have another backup big there, and you have Giannis at the 5 as well, in addition to Brook. I was just like,
he is the player I think it makes the most sense. If they did have to trade a core player who makes a lot, I think he is the one that makes sense. But also everyone loves him. He's so locked in. I think quietly has actually improved defensively quite a bit. He's not a great defender.
Better, I feel like over the past 2 or 3 years as a switch defender, it feels like.
Yeah, he can't drop. I hope they never have him drop. He just gets lost, and it's hard to do. It's a lot is but switching he's pretty good.
Just because you watch Brook Lopez do it, and then you go.
No, it's both. It's both. Yeah, trust me. It's every time that I'm like, oh no, he's not going the right direction at all.
He's also weird, and I don't mean to make another Knicks analog, but how Julius Randle is more important to the Knicks than any other team could value him. Bobby Portis feels that way a little bit to Milwaukee, where it's he might be more important to them than any other team that could feasibly want him.
It's funny, Marcus Johnson, who's tremendous as the Bucks color commentator, last year was kind of mentioning him as a core piece, and you kind of look at it and it's the things he can do, his size, he's locked into contract, he's very young, so he's 27, 28. For the Bucks, that's very young. It kind of makes sense, but his shooting in the playoffs hasn't been as good. And that's been, he called out someone for saying he wasn't good defensively after the Celtics playoff loss postseason. And he was right. He actually did. I think it was Chris Herring, which made it hilarious because I was no one, Chris Herring's great. Come on, Bobby.
Right.
But he was incorrect in Bobby did not have a bad defensive postseason. He couldn't make shots, and that's why he lost the role. So it is if he could just make shots consistently, threes offensively, he could be someone who, as I just said, he's most likely role player to get traded. Could also go into being an indispensable piece this year. If they're playing differently and a shot is more consistent. I think there is more up in the air than usual for the Bucks, which is still very little for most other NBA teams. We know the core 4, we know vaguely who will play. There's no one is saying that they don't. John Horst is a liar or whatever else. So, thankfully,
and this will be matchup dependent to some extent, but what will be their most preferred closing lineup? Is it just the starting 5, or do you think there's wiggle room in that 5th spot? Again, we're talking about 4 locks. They're already right there.
I think Connaughton is more locked in, or will be. He's going to have to prove it again, but I think he's been the better playoff player to Grayson. I think they trust him more late in games, or at least they have. He is a bit older. Again, this could change, but based on everything we've seen from the last X number of years, I guess 2 with Grayson. I would say Pat and the core 4, and then if they have to go smaller, that's when maybe it is Grayson, maybe it's Crowder for the defensive size. It's hard to say right now, but I would say, the small ball, it would be then one of Grayson or Crowder for Brook if he's not able to stay on the floor.
They're a weirdo lineup that you really want to see them try this year.
I really want them to get another point guard and let Jrue play off the ball. They don't have it right now, really. But I was looking it up, and like that series everyone talks about against the Pelican, or when he was a Pelican against the Blazers, where it's like good to have a guy who did that to Damian Lillard once on the team, I guess, just in case. Rajon Rondo was the point guard when he had that great offensive series and that great defensive series. And I was like, it's Rondo had like 10 assists per game that would be nice to have something. I really wanted John Wall before he we saw him play a lot. But I would like to see Jrue, MarJon, Khris, Pat, Giannis, I think is going to be really fun and really lean into like the strengths of MarJon, which is having a wide open floor and a bunch of opportunity and a bunch of good passers, a bunch of shooting around him. His shooting ultimately will determine if that's going to be a viable lineup, but I really like that idea, and I really hope we see some of that this season.
I would love to see a big man list lineup from them.
Oh, yeah.
Just to see like what ends up happening. And I don't technically want to see any lineup that doesn't have Giannis on the floor, but if he's just like, you're going to give him and Brook a spell together, give me Jrue, Khris Middleton. I think Pat Connaughton needs to be a part of it. Let's throw Malik Beasley or AJ Green in there, who's ever better shooting at that point than Jay Crowder. And like that's your de facto five. And just like, what does it look like? It'd just be a curiosity. Like maybe you soup up the offense and it comes at the expense of the defense, but at the same time, you're looking at 3 to 4 above average defenders in general in that lineup. I don't think they would ever try.
They actually they did
lineups for
they did a little bit of Khris at center last year, and like very, very limited. And it kind of worked in the very small. I was like, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say he was like playing center, but he was their biggest player on the court. And it's like, wow, you never would have thought I'd see the day, and it kind of works. So you might be onto something there.
Their over-under is set at 53.5, which is the same as it was when we recorded last year. Are you taking the over or the under on that, and where do you think they stack up in the larger context of the East?
I'm hammering the over again. I mean, I think it's more of a lock this year.
And what did he miss 19 games last year?
Oh, look at Khris. I mean, Khris was good for like a dozen games. I mean, and I think they're at least functionally as deep, maybe deeper, maybe less deep, but it's close. I mean, they're not really shallow coming in. I think over. I have them first in the East, both in playoff equity and for regular season wins. Even experimenting with new stuff, I just think like we know what they can do to a certain extent, and they're really good. And I think, we talked a little bit about either before or early on the pod, like the rest of the East, outside of like the Cavs, who are like, on the way up, they look good. It's credit to the Cavs. Pretty much everyone else is like in flux or like maybe staying the same.
It's weird to say that when you're looking at good Eastern Conference teams, the ones that we have the most information about are the Knicks and the Cavs at this point, because of the moves that Boston made, Miami losing some guys, not knowing what's going on with Dame, the whole James Harden situation in Philly. I think it kind of, Mikal Bridges' breakout eclipsed this, but like the Nets weren't good when like Mikal Bridges was their best player. Toronto's just going through an existential crisis or whatever it is. So, and then like the Bulls are the Bulls are the Bulls. Will the Magic or the Pacers make a leap? Maybe. Detroit's still kind of rebuilding. Washington's going to be annoyed if they win more than 12 games, probably. So it's just like, it's weird to say the Bucks we know the top of the East for sure. This might be, we haven't done our over-under pod like Grant and I yet for the like 2 conferences. If this holds 53.5, they're going to wind up being one of my best. They just won 58. And I would argue the East is even less open now. Like the top is just closed off. There's more separation between the Bucks and literally everyone else. Like I think there are 2 teams that could realistically sniff them. Maybe Miami if they get Dame, but it's Cleveland and it's whatever the theory is in Boston.
Right. No, I agree. I think Philly, maybe they'll get through it again. I feel like they just asked Embiid to shoulder so much this and the Simmons season. I don't know if there's going to be as much enthusiasm. And I think, the Bucks weirdly kind of played horrible in some big games and just got absolutely shit kicked last season. And I kind of wonder will the rejuvenation of doing stuff new maybe even put a little pep in their step? We'll see. Usually Vegas is on, but yeah, I agree. I think this is
they blew it out of the water last year. They were 4.5 wins over, which is pretty big discrepancy for Vegas. Anything else or anyone else that we have not touched upon I didn't ask you about over the last 80 minutes that you think needs to be discussed?
We've done such a good, thorough job. I would say we just didn't he didn't sign and isn't the guy. We didn't talk a bunch of Jrue, and I do think if he can just be put in better positions offensively, maybe a little more structure, how much can that change for them in itself? That's a big question. That's like there are Bucks people who are really like out on Jrue after just had a really bad playoffs against Miami. Can we just get him a little more direction, a little more infrastructure around him and his decision making, so he's not, I think the Bud let it fly thing probably went too far. And it's like, yeah, jack up a 3 at 18 seconds. Who cares?
He hits those step back threes in the regular season, apparently. I don't know what it is about
that qualifier matters a lot, though, Dan. That's a really important qualifier. It is not held up at all in the playoffs. So that's going to be the thing. It's just like, if he's really set in like a better space offensively, do they just actually kind of like blow through the East? Maybe they do. I don't know. I never like to be too optimistic, but I do think Jrue is a big swing. And if he just plays better in this playoffs, which Bucks fans have been saying for 3 years now, they could be a much more threatening team going forward.
Ti, this was great as always. Thank you for giving me so much of your time. Are you able to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the great work that you do?
I am. So we cover GSPN. We cover the Bucks, of course, with 2 podcasts. We also cover the Brewers and Packers, if you're into those Wisconsin sports. We also cover film. I don't watch enough movies, but we have guys who do that. GSPN.info. You can find all of our links, so please check us out. And, of course, subscribe to this podcast everywhere on the internet if you're not already, because it is truly fantastic.
Thank you so much for the kind words, and again, for all your time as always. And as you know by now, I'll be pestering you again at some point in the future.